The fact that AOC is in the same party as Joe Biden shows that these parties are very, very stupid. They don't represent the will of any sensible, coherent voting group. These people are diametrically opposed. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Haman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Haman.
Hello there. Welcome to another edition of Haman Nature. With me, as always, is my little spiny buddy, Tyrone. How you doing?
Konnichiwa, Adam-san. I'm doing well, my friend.
This is an American show. We ain't going to have none of that Japanese jibber-jabber. I wanted to talk to you today about yet another article I wrote, this one about political sausage, which should fill you with revulsion and disgust if you were a normal human being. And I keyed off of an article, or a Twitter/X post written by Senator from Utah, Mike Lee, in early February, I think the 1st, where he was railing about the way the congressional overlords sort of force people into voting for things they haven't even read yet, and throwing issues together into a bill that have nothing to do with one another, and sort of holding people hostage. The issues he was talking about was foreign aid to Ukraine and Israel being smashed together with funding for border defense. So giving people sort of a Sophie's choice if you're, depending on how you feel about either of those issues. You have to vote for something you don't like, maybe, or cut down something you do like. And so he wrote a post that just talked about he calls it the firm, TM, the firm of McConnell and Schumer. What I wanted to talk to you about, Tyrone, today is just the myth that we all get in junior high, say, about what our representative government supposedly is, in which the smartest and most capable and wise of us select amongst ourselves the kindest and most reasonable, seasoned, intelligent people, send these people to Washington, and then they deliberate with others from around the country, and can consult great works of philosophy and political literature, the kind of books you'd expect wise people would read in a classical education, Aristotle and Cicero. And then they'd craft wise and benevolent rules, regulations, so that us mediocrities in the gutter will have firm and wise leadership, and then they'll discuss these laws, legislation, and vote on them, and only the best, only the most truly noble legislation will pass through that crucible. And ladies and gentlemen, that is just nonsense in every particular. What happens is the leadership in both these parties hold the people that you elect hostage. They withhold positions in highly sought after committees. They withhold funding, help, which you can't get reelected. Anyway, it's just a crony mess, and I thought it was worth writing about and talking about. What do you think, Tyrone?
Well, first of all, another really good article, timely topic, because not only is it a relevant topic, the Mike Lee article or post about the war funding that's going on currently, but also it's an evergreen topic because this really is how the sausage is made, so to speak, as you put it. And I think, that fairy tale vision of, I'm just a bill here on Capitol Hill. I mean, what a farce that is. And I struggle to believe anybody really thinks that's the way it works anymore. I really think that everybody realizes it's all corrupt. But for some reason, we just continue to go along with it. So that's the piece that really puzzles me. I think if you were to ask any Joe Blow on the street, hey, you think these politicians are working in your best interest and all this legislation they're making is, for the good of humanity? Don't you think like 10 out of 10 people would just sort of laugh in your face about that? I mean, what do you think? Do you think people really think anybody over the age of 13 that that's the way a bill is made on Capitol Hill. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I think two things. The world is complex, and most people don't really understand much about what goes on in politics. Most people don't understand how the water gets to their faucet. I mean, we didn't
Mm,
evolve to live in such a complex world. So we sort of naturally look to the people sitting in higher positions on the hierarchy and trust them that what they're doing is for the best. And also, let us not forget, indoctrination is a hell of a thing, and the state gets to mold your kids' opinions about the world for 13 years, their most formative 13 years. And if that's the case, why wouldn't they just trust what they were taught, that the government just has its your best interests at heart? And if you notice something that's wrong, well, the system is dynamic, and we have elections every 2 years, roughly, for various positions. And if the electorate is truly unhappy and truly getting screwed, well, they can just vote themselves a system that they're more happy with. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with the system. We just need to vote a little bit better. And so few Americans do vote. I
mm,
mean, that's really the problem. It's voter apathy. We just need to educate these people. So
mm,
the people that are screwing us over, quite deliberately so, have all manner of indoctrination tropes that they can throw out to make it the public's fault, really, not theirs. And I think that's a tough hurdle to overcome in the minds of most people who, again, are busy and they don't have time to read everything in the news and history and philosophy, figure it all out.
Before we go any further, I thought it was really funny when he called it the firm. When you first start reading the article, you're like, the firm TM. And then, he has EM. And then, he has that line, the firm of McConnell and Schumer, whatever. And it just reminds me of that Modern Family episode where Phil Dunphy invents the head scratcher TM. I don't, I don't know. It was
I
pretty
am
funny.
always a big fan of the comedic use of the trademark symbol.
Especially anti-intellectual property guys like us. But
Right.
but I think the key point I want to focus on, you use the term oligarchy in your article. And I think sometimes people will use that term, but maybe not exactly understand precisely what it means. They're using it sort of as this amorphous blob type of criticism of the system we live in. I think oligarchy is probably close to what we live in today. But I think the point is that oligarchies are not made up of the people you think they're made up of. So I think the point of the senator's post is that the oligarchies are not right left.
Right.
There's not an oligarchy on the right and an oligarchy on the left. No, the oligarchy is the left and right combined.
For sure.
And
What
it's and the and it's the split is delusional. It's what am I trying to say? It's a
well,
mirage, right? This left right divide.
yeah, if you're familiar with the world, the wrestling, fake wrestling, this is kayfabe, which is why I very much like that Senator Lee called it's the firm of Schumer and McConnell. It's the leaders in the Senate of both the Democrats and the Republicans doing it. And it's worth going through the sort of the process that he describes. He says this happens over and over, and it's a plan. Part one is to spend months drafting legislation in complete secrecy, which is how these bills are made. They're not written by your legislators, they're written by some bunch of lobbyists and special interests. Phase two is aggressively market the legislation based not on its details, which, after all, no one has seen, or the practical implications, whether they're good or they're bad. But no, you market this legislation only on its broadest, least controversial objective, just what it claims to do. So you spend all the time, write the stuff in secret, market it, in Fox News and CNN and all these little places. And then phase three is you let various members see the text of the bill for the first time, only a few days, sometimes a few goddamn hours, no joke, before they are required to vote on the bill based on an arbitrary deadline set by who? By the firm, trademark of Schumer and McConnell. And then phase 4 is forcing that vote, denying the senators any chance to read or digest or debate. Remember the myth? We're supposed to be debating this legislation, right? It just doesn't happen. And then you force these people to vote the way they want to. That's what the whips are all about. And the backroom deal to force you to vote is to withhold financing assistance, or again to withhold spots in committees, or with your sweetheart deals and connections with the RNC, you'll get primaried the next time you get run. Members of your own party will attack you if you don't fall in line. And so, rather than the myth of how we think representative democracy works, you instead get this cabal. And yeah, oligarchy usually, we usually think of crony business interests sidling up to government power to enforce a monopolistic or quasi-monopolistic system. But oligarchy is really, I think you're right, Tyrone. It's just a power structure coalescing around a few people, and it's not usually the people that you think. In this case, it's not just the political party you don't belong to; it's the regime.
Yeah, I want to read a short little passage from your article and then ask you a follow up question. So, we are ruled over by a corrupt oligarchy of venal interests, and those interests are diametrically opposed to your well being. Your own particular representatives are either in on it or powerless to stop it. The only relief the citizenry ever get from this corrupt process is that sometimes the interests of the various criminals in charge of it have competing visions of the best way to fleece and hobble us. When they find common ground, the criminality is dubbed bipartisan. I want to focus in on that term oligarchy. Can you kind of define that a little bit better for us? I just feel like it's this loose term. And what are we meaning here?
I'm probably going to screw up the definition, but I usually just refer to it as, instead of one single centralized power, like in a king or a specific monopolist, it's the same government power, but just split up between interests that sometimes compete, like an aristocracy before the court of a king. That's the oligarchy part. I view it as a centralized political power, but not resting in one locus, but rather a horde, a cabal.
What do you see as sort of mm, the main oligarch groups in America right now? Are they easy to point out? Would you say, we throw around terms like military industrial complex, okay, pharmaceutical industrial complex, okay, the political elite, okay, um, but what does that mean? Do you divide? I guess in your mind, who are the biggest oligarchs that we have in America? Do you have any thoughts on
The
that?
ones you mentioned are pretty big. I'd also throw in there things like the teachers' unions, the really big voices in media, Fox and CNN, for example. Um,
The
there.
problem I have with looking at it like that is
Well, let
so
me throw in
it
one
okay,
more
go ahead.
group. Whatever it is that stays ossified in the government, regardless of who gets elected. In in England, you'd call it the civil service structure. We call it the regime or the deep state. Um, but that's if I when I think of the oligarchy, I usually think of these people. They're in power. They're always going to be in power. Your vote doesn't really matter. Any individual appendage of the blob can get fired, maybe if it gets too much heat on it, too much attention. But nothing ever really changes in the structure. Those people, I would say, comprise this oligarchy of which I speak. And then these other interests that you mentioned, they're sort of along for the ride, you know?
I don't want to consider, let's say, just some factory. Uh, I I don't want to look at, say, the production line worker at a factory that happens to work for Boeing as part of the oligarch, right? Yes, I suppose if you want to say he's working for an evil corporation, I don't know, somehow that makes him evil too. I'm not willing to go there.
Just because there aren't clear distinctions doesn't mean, or black and white distinctions doesn't mean there aren't distinctions. Every guy who drives a truck and took a Teamster's card, to be able to have that job and feed his family isn't Jimmy Hoffa. Not every guy who turns a lug nut on an aircraft at Boeing is part of the military industrial complex. So of course we make these distinctions. The higher ups are holding the need for a job of their members. They're holding them hostage as much as they're holding us hostage. So yeah, I agree with you on that point.
So far, what you've described to me seems like just one big giant blob. So the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, that never leave, the military industrial complex, the media. To me, it seems like they're all on the same side. But you clearly put in your article that the only relief the citizens get every once in a while is when the competing oligarchs are going head to head against each other. But who's competing? Like, I don't think Boeing and Pfizer are against each other. Like, to me, they're all on the same team. So, like, who are the different oligarchs and who are opposed to each other? Like, so think of Game of Thrones. Okay, so the seven powerful houses in Game of Thrones, yeah, they're all part of the kingdom, but they're clearly at war with each other for power and control. But I don't see the corporate media, the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex, the teachers unions, or the FDA, or the bureaucrats, any of them fighting against each other. Like,
They're fighting all the time. You cannot simultaneously support the kind of subsidies and protections for big oil, for example, and advance the socialist Green New Deal. Those are two entities that are using different kinds of government power to further their interest, and they are diametrically opposed. And then there's stuff like that. Um, like the interest of agricultural subsidies are going to come at an expense of other people who have competing interests for that land. So it's not like a great respite the public gets when these people fight. It's just sometimes you'll get log jams where not everything that these people dream up can get shoved down our throats. Uh, the gears of the machine sort of get gummed up, and it's usually when, oddly enough, the public is least happy. They talk about do nothing Congresses when stuff like this is gearing up the machine. But that's actually the best time because the government isn't imposing its will on you because they're fighting amongst themselves.
so I think the point, or the idea maybe I'm trying to get at here is, suppose, to stick with my Game of Thrones example. So suppose I'm a very small minor house and I don't have a lot of land or territory, but I have ambitions to become more powerful or to break off and be my own kingdom or something like that. But I'm in this system. I'm under the thumb of the Iron Throne and the powerful houses, and I'm just basically a serf and don't know how to get out of it. But if I could sow division and put a wedge in between House Stark and House Lannister and get them to fight each other and destroy themselves, then I can be left standing at the end of the day and get that power. So if there are these different oligarchs, groups in America, is there a way for us to find ways to put a wedge in between them and get them to fight each other? Like, is that a practical path towards more liberty, that we could somehow encourage these two groups to go to war with each other and just let them destroy themselves?
That would be nice. And as much as I like the what's it called, the Kingdom of Westeros, as much as I like the Game of Thrones analogy, it breaks down because when two factions fight on that show, they march out into the fields and just have at each other. They kind of mostly leave the citizenry alone. It's not really how it happens in a quote unquote republic democracy. And usually, what happens when smaller factions want to advance themselves is they just pick a side and then, negotiate themselves some increased largesse, increased territory for helping one side defeat the other, which I think is more accurate in our own system. It looks more like that, which is why you'll see strange bedfellows in politics because, deals have been made. And as far as pitting these forces against each other to weaken them and increase our own sphere of liberty, I'm all for it, but I don't see how. I just don't see how to accomplish that. Um, do you?
So then are we stuck? I mean, are we just screwed? Are we just having a podcast to just sort of like, well,
Well, we're not
you know,
screwed. We just have to realize that, I mean, people have been making this point as long as people thought about liberty. It is the case that the parasitic group that rules over us is much, much smaller than the host. We outnumber them, but we are moved into inaction because we have adopted their frame of reference. We've adopted their ideology. Again, they grab our kids from K through 12 and educate them to think this way, to think that Hobbes was right, and without these our overlords to protect us, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So I think it's things like this podcast. We need to educate the host body, which outnumbers the parasite class by thousands to one, and get them to shrug the parasite off. Maybe we can't revolt. Maybe we do revolt. But I think just withholding the sanction of the victim, as Ayn Rand would call it, just withholding our support for the ideology, the political philosophy that supports this corrupt system. If we withhold our support for that, then they don't get these victories, these legislative victories. Protest does work. I remember in Obama's time, I think he wanted to actively do a regime change in Syria or something instead of just the tacit one that the CIA does. And public opposition made him not do that. They're trying to roll out all these central bank digital currencies, and the public resistance is slowing that down. So even just not agreeing on one particular issue makes them stop and retrench. What would happen if we just all rose up in mass and said, "Oh yeah, political power is poison, and the sphere of government influence in our lives should shrink dramatically, so that the private sphere can enlarge, and in that way we regain our freedom." I think nothing is more important in this battle than ideas. It literally has to be that we change our ideas in our heads about what we want the structure of our government to look like.
yeah, I mean, I'm trying not to be too depressed and black-pilled about the world. It's getting harder and harder every day. But I think because I don't know, I don't really see secession as working. We'll see. I mean, if that's going to be the path to liberty, then I think that's almost going to have to come from the left. I mean, Trump gets reelected and California, Oregon, and Washington split off. I mean, right? But I don't really see that happening. Um,
Secession is the worst form of what I'm talking about when things get as bad as they possibly could be. But before that, you can always have nullification. You know,
mhm.
the members of any state outnumber the enforcement arm of any particular federal agency. Just withhold your support. All California wanted to have to do is ignore federal drug laws, and then everyone could smoke legally in California, despite the fact that the federal overlord strictly forbade it. So, peaceful nullification of laws, just ignoring that. If you ignore it,
Mhm,
it's almost like was it Tinkerbell? If you didn't believe in her, she would cease to exist
mhm.
or something. The government's
Sure,
almost like that. They
it
they have
is.
so much
It's 100%
power
a
over
thing.
us, but if we withhold our faith in the government, just like Tinkerbell, it will fade away into nothing. We don't need to violently insurrect. We just need to ignore these people. Say no. Yeah, nice idea, but we're not doing that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things that could really shake this up, and it really wouldn't be that hard to do. Just need somebody with the will to do it. One idea would be, to stop the federal tax withholding from your paychecks. I think that would immediately change things. If you had to write a check on April 15th every year for all the taxes you owed, and you saw it with your, rather than it just being taken away from you before you even see it, I think that would create quite the political revolt. But two, I think, and this one's actually happening, and you're seeing this more and more, the split from the bigger parties to these smaller minor parties growing more and more and more. I think for the first time since Ross Perot, we're going to have a legitimate third candidate in RFK Jr., right? And I remember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had a quote not too long ago. She said, if we were in Europe or any other country, me and Joe Biden wouldn't be in the same party, right? Because we have
Sure.
this weird, massive duopoly in America versus coalition governments in other countries. So I see the bigger groups splintering. I mean, look at the Republican Party. That thing's split in half right now. You've got the neocons and I don't know what you want to call the other side, the not neocons, whatever. And so the Republican Party is at least split in two. Probably could split a few more different ways. There's dozens of these smaller grassroots parties, and I think they're getting a little bit more traction here and there in certain pockets. So as the big groups splinter, then I think that has the potential to maybe tear down a few of these oligarchic systems. But I don't know, man. Great article as always. Any final last words of advice, or I don't know, what can you give me to make me feel better about myself today?
Scrolling through the article to see if I left on a white pill here. Nah, just says get smarter. I mean, essentially, you're right. I think I wish I knew more about how these other parliaments worked, where small parties actually had some sort of ability to gain seats in the legislature rather than one winner take all sort of a deal. I think you'd have to change something about our constitution to make that happen. I think it's structural. I worry we're going to, what's more likely than the proliferation of smaller, third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties is they'll unify. They'll become they'll abandon the moniker we gave them of duopoly and say, no, you're right. It's just one party. And despite the fact that, like in my state of Nevada, the largest voting group isn't Republicans or Democrats, it's independents. So just like you were alluding to, people are sick of these two parties and what they ostensibly stand for. And yeah, the fact that AOC is in the same party as Joe Biden shows that these parties are very, very stupid. They don't represent the will of any sensible, coherent voting group. These people are diametrically opposed. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Right.
And what's happening as the rise of independents, politically homeless people happens in this country is they're changing the way the rules of the Secretary of State in all these states functions, so that it becomes harder for third parties to get on the ballot. The fact that RFK Jr. is learning the hard way right now. And as we've mentioned before, it might have been in our very first episode, Tyrone, that it was these small independent parties and their ability to get a foothold in the political system when the winds of change blow that allowed Millet to take his brand new infant political party, basically the Libertarian Party, whatever the word for it is in Spanish, and win the presidency just a handful of years later. So we should push in that direction. I don't know if it's possible, but we should push for it.
Right. But before we wrap up, I got to ask, what's a political vegan?
Well, I believe I mentioned how the sausage was made in the title of that article, which we will link to, ladies and gentlemen. So, yeah, I just don't like this kind of sausage. All right. Thank you very much, Tyrone. Great conversation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll catch you next time.
We are ruled over by a corrupt oligarchy of venal interests, and those interests are diametrically opposed to your well being. Your own particular representatives are either in on it or powerless to stop it. The only relief the citizens say that 5 times fast.